So, yeah, that we're going, that plant tasting that we just concluded was of the two lichens that we're going to talk about as the main plants that we're looking at today, being Usnea and Lobaria, which is this one. Oh, these are good. Oh, we can sell that. So yeah, these are both lichens. And lichens are really interesting organisms. They are like a mutualistic organism or symbiotic organism composed of algae, fungus, and cyanobacteria. They all live together in one body. And they're really neat. They grow all over the place. They often grow in places where it's challenging for other organisms to grow. They're part of the bryophyte class of organisms. So unlike plants, they don't have stems or like vasculature, really, nor do they have roots. And so I'm rehydrating this one because the color changes when they dry up. And so since they don't have roots, there's that nice green color. They absorb their nutrients directly from the air. So yeah, lichens, they grow via spores. They release spores into the air. They're really dependent upon water, the presence of water in the environment in order to be like metabolizing and active. And so the spores need to land in some water. And they have like lichens and mosses, they all have this their sexual reproduction is like really interesting in that it's not just two gametes or like two sexual cells meeting. There's like several. And they combine in like genetically interesting ways. It's a lot more complicated. And they have like several, there's like the spore stage and then the gametophyte stage, and then they go into this kind of like fruiting body stage. They're kind of like, they grow like mosses kind of. And is this too cold? Do we need to go into the barn? Everybody okay? Okay. Also Joe's in there. And so yeah, lichens are super abundant. They're all over the place, and they I don't like love this term, but people call them kind of like colonizer species, or they can occupy places where it's very hard for other plants especially to live. So they often grow on like rocks, they grow on your roof, they like to grow on buildings, places where there isn't a lot of soil. And they often, in doing that, will start the process of creating soil. They'll like kind of attach themselves to this spot. They grow, they go about their lives, they die, and they turn into dirt. They decompose into dirt. And then other plants can grow there. So that's the colonizer thing. But, you know, colonialism is a horrific process, at least within sort of like the human world. And I think that what these guys do is really different than that. Again, they're very dependent upon the presence of moisture in order to be able to live and have their metabolism functioning. Also, like interestingly, when it gets dry, their metabolisms just stop. They basically enter a state of kind of suspended animation. And they can be in that state for a really long time. This is also true of mosses. So like I studied bryophyte taxonomy and botany, and so we looked a lot at mosses and liverworts and hornworts and lichens. And so you can store them in boxes, like, you know, if you're doing botanical studies, you often end up with like little samples of whatever you're studying, and you dry them and you press them, or you put them in a little box, and then you look at them under a microscope. And with the mosses and the lichens, like, you'll dry them out, stick them in a box, and then they can live in like a botanical collection for like a decade, and then you can take them out of that box, rehydrate them, and they're like living organisms again. They've just been kind of sleeping in there. And that's cool. Oh, and yeah, if I'm talking about lichens, I might as well also, just as a quick tangent, living along with the lichens and mosses are these tiny little organisms called tardigrades, or water bears. Has anyone ever heard of these? They are little tiny microorganisms. They're animals technically, and is that even true? Maybe they're considered bugs. But they kind of look like little bears, except they have 6 legs, but their faces look like bears. Do a little Google image search sometime. And they live all over the place. They mostly live on mosses, lichens, liverworts, hornworts. So all of these more plant-like organisms that dry up and rehydrate. And the tardigrades also dry up and rehydrate, and when they dry up, they curl up into a little ball, which is called a tun, T-U-N, and go into a suspended animation, and they can stay that way for years, decades, and then once they warm up again, they just roll out and they start trundling about again and eating stuff. And scientists have just done terrible things to these little creatures when they're in that suspended animation state, including like shooting them into space, putting them in extreme vacuums, putting them in extreme cold, putting them in extreme heat, and they can just survive it all. Like, as long as they're in their little tune, then they can just have all sorts of really intense, terrible things happen to them, and then you just rehydrate them and they wake up and start trundling around again. That has nothing to do with herbalism, but I just think that's interesting. And yeah, in the forests around here, we're blessed with a lot of bryophytes and a lot of lichens. So you find them in the trees. That's usually where you find these guys. If you're looking for them, they'll be up in trees. They attach themselves to the trees with little holdfasts. They don't have roots. And they grow there, and they absorb the nutrients from the air, including nitrogen. They're nitrogen-fixing plants, or they're nitrogen-fixing organisms. So, like, right, nitrogen is a very important food source for all plants. But the atmosphere is made up of, I don't know what percentage, quite a bit of the atmosphere is elemental nitrogen, except in that form, nitrogen is not edible by plants. And so nitrogen gets fixed, as in goes from elemental nitrogen into like nitrates and nitrites, which are basically just a little molecular tweak. And in that form, they are available for plants to eat. So lightning does this. Bacteria do this, often in conjunction with plants. So like nitrogen fixing plants that we call nitrogen fixers, such as like peas and beans and alders and Scotch bream is. It's not the plants themselves that fix nitrogen. There's little bacteria that live in their roots, and those are the ones that do the nitrogen fixing. But basically, they can absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into a form that plants can then eat. So they turn the air into plants, basically, and then we can eat the plants. We also feed the plants with nitrogen with our poo and our pee. So the lichens also fix nitrogen just straight out of the air. They pull elemental nitrogen into themselves, and it's probably the cyanobacteria, which is one of the organisms that makes up a lichen, that does the nitrogen fixing. And so that feeds the lichens, and then that often also feeds the trees that they live on. In some trees, especially maples, which is where you'll often find Lobaria, the lungwort, the lichens and also the mosses will get really thick on them. You can see there's a maple back there that's just covered in moss, and those trees will actually grow what are called adventitious roots out of the sides of themselves, out of their branches, into the mosses and lichens, which eventually kind of turns into soil, and they will like eat that or drink it as like a nutrition for themselves. And then also the nitrates, the edible forms of nitrogen will be washed away from the lichens by the rain when the rains come. And then also the lichens get knocked to the ground, or they decompose into the soil and increase the soil and also provide nitrogen to the environment. So they feed the tree in that way. I've often heard them compared to like the lungs of the forest, or people talk a lot about them as a metaphor for lungs, and they do have like, I don't know if you're familiar with lung anatomy, but there's like the alveoli. Basically like the interior of lungs are like fractal branching, ever smaller little vessels that fill with gases. And the growth form of both Lobaria and Usnea somewhat mimic that. And also they make food from the air, extract energy from the air like our lungs do, and they are also sensitive to pollution like our lungs are, and so the presence or absence of lichens is a good indicator of air quality. Like in places with very heavy pollution or with the excess of the like acidic rain, or especially like industrial pollutants, they're very sensitive to like sulfur compounds, which a lot of industrial processes produce in abundance. Get out of there! Get out! The lichens will die. So yeah, they're really neat. I love organisms that are like mutualistic relationships, and these guys are so helpful to the forest. And yeah, they're also helpful to us. These are some of the first harvests that I do on the like wheel of the year, because in the wintertime when it's very wet and cold, most of the other plants are like sleeping or dormant, but that's when the lichens and the mosses are like doing their thing. They're very much awake and active at that time of year, and that's when they do most of their sexual reproduction, especially the mosses. If you get like a little islands, and really look at the mosses this time of they all have their little spore fights up, which is them having sex with each other basically. And also, in a very practical sense, in the wintertime, all the deciduous trees have dropped their leaves, and so you can see the lichens because they're up in the trees. And then also in the wintertime, we have big storms, snow, and lots of wind, which knocks the lichens down off of the trees and snaps the branches out of the trees upon which the lichens live. And so it's just a good time to find them. Lichens are pretty slow-growing organisms, and I would really encourage, I think some judicious picking off of some trees sometimes might be okay, but in my own practice, I only really pick windfall. I'll walk around and I'll look for stuff that's already been knocked to the ground. They're not going to survive forever on the ground. However, even in that situation, you don't want to just pick it all up because that's food. They're feeding the forest, and so as usual, don't take everything. And just because it's knocked to the ground doesn't mean it's yours. They're doing their own life, and they're doing their own work for and with the forests. So it's important to leave a bunch of them on the ground. Although often you can really find them in abundance when you find them. I've never managed to propagate them from spores, although people do that. That's more like lab culture technique. But along with reproducing via sporulation, all lichens and both of these species reproduce vegetatively as well, clonally, meaning if a little fragment breaks off and gets blown somewhere by the wind and lands in another place that is hospitable to them, they can just anchor themselves there and then just grow a new lichen out of themselves, kind of like cuttings from trees. So a good propagation technique for these guys, which does work well, it's a long, slow process, but I have started a few patches that I have tracked and watched them start growing, is you can do vegetative reproduction by taking a good handful of the lichen in question, putting it in a blender, adding some water, and maybe adding something like a little bit gooey. Like I wonder about like glycerin, or people recommend like yogurt. Blending it all up, and then spreading that in a place where you think they would like to live. I don't even know who that is. And now the trick is, you want them to stay somewhat wet. Like I think it's best to do this process in the winter, and you don't want them to all get washed off of the tree. So like I'll usually put them in like the crook of a tree, or like the crotch of a tree. It's Jen. And sometimes they've even like stretched a little piece of like muslin over them or something like this, just to keep the really direct rain from nailing them too hard, which will just wash them all off the tree. But you can also just do it thickly. Like even a good spot that I've had success with is like you often find them like on the top of old fence posts where it's all kind of rotten and it's like a hollow. Like pour it in there and they can stay there and they'll start growing. I know that like Skeeter talks about this in the book that I showed you guys. I think the government in BC was like hydroseeding the forest, where they would make like a Usnea slurry and just dump it on the forests from plains. I think it was something about like remediation or like pollution remediation. I don't remember the specifics. But no, it's a long-term process. It's a slow process because they are slow growing. But I always imagine that we'll try it together one of these years, and I don't think it's going to be this year unless it's next month, which maybe it will be. But if you ever run into these and are interested in trying it, I would really encourage it. It's very easy. You just put it in a blender, blend it all up, find a spot, and pour the goo all over it. And I feel like, especially if it's material they were picking up off the ground, you could stretch muslin, or you could just do it. And it's okay if it all gets, it's practice. And even if a little bit of it takes and starts reproducing, then that's a big win. And you could, if you're a biology lab kind of person, like if you're into growing mushrooms or something like that, or someone who is, you can definitely grow them in controlled environments pretty quickly and easily. And those can be reintroduced, or it'd be interesting to grow them in controlled environments and then use them as medicine. That could be fun. I mean, I do have a lot of that biology lab stuff is really dependent on a lot of plastic and shit that you just throw away. So I have some issues with lab cultivation, but I'd be curious to try. Yeah, that's kind of their ecology. They're pretty common. They grow all over the world. Circumglobally, I think mostly in the northern part of the globe, but yeah, in the forests mostly, although you do find them in rocky places, and I think they do go pretty far north up into the places where there aren't many trees. At least there's tons of mosses up there and lichens, and I think these species are represented up there. Yeah, they're really great, just as organisms and as members of the ecosystem, the environment, or whatever. In terms of medicine, I'll start with Usnea. This is this is Usnea. This is not Usnea. And Usnea is pretty abundant. There's a lot of different species, and honestly, at this point when I harvest or when I make medicine and I label my medicines, I just write Usnea SPP for the Latin name, which means I don't know the species. just because, to be perfectly honest, I don't know the species of the ones that I'm gathering. Like I used to say, I would, just off the top of my head, I would call this Usnea barbata, which is like a shorter form that grows in this bushy way. But there's a lot of species, and I sent some to a client once, labeling it as Usnea barbata, and he was like, "How do you know that? Did you look at it under a microscope? Did you do there's like chemical tests that you can do, and there's very like nitpicky stuff you can do to determine species." And I don't do that, and maybe I will someday, but I don't currently. And so, just to be perfectly honest, I just label them on all Usnea SPP. Also, when I'm gathering Usnea, I just get any Usneas that I find and I mix them all together. I'm never going for one species. There is one species, Usnea longissima, which is what people often call man's beard, which I think you referenced earlier. And that's long. Like, you'll find these big tufts of them. That species is considered scarce, like not quite endangered, but not very abundant. And that species is very slow growing. So if you find those big clumps, that's like old. That's an old organism, like probably much older than you are. And I generally don't pick that species. If I find like a whole bunch of them all over the ground, I might gather some, but it's really tempting. You'll see the huge dangle on the tree, and it's really tempting to just pull it down. But I would really encourage you to not do that. Also, that species mostly grows in more like old growthy type forests, which also we're losing more of every day. And so it's nice to like not mess with that species too much, but admire them when you see them. They're very beautiful. Also, if you're it can be really easy in the forest around here. You'll see it looks like Usnea, and it's very long, and it's really tempting to be like, wow, I just found this huge amount of Usnea, but there's a lookalike which is called Alectoria. The common name is witch's hair. People often call it witch's hair. A good Pojar has some good lichen ID stuff, just from identification from pictures. That's when I used to call this barbata. But so look out for the Alectoria. And now the main way to identify lichen from other species, to identify Usnea from other lichen species, because there are a lot of them that kind of look like Usnea, is the presence of this central cord. So the Usnea has these. Also, for those of you watching this video, I'm going to take a close-up picture of the central cord and post it. But I don't want to get too close to my camera person due to COVID concerns to do a close-up of the cord. Or maybe I'll pass it to you. You can do it. We'll see. But anyway, if you find something that you think is Usnea, you can tell if it is or not by grabbing one little bit of the thallus. The body of lichens are called a thallus. And pull. And you pull gently, and the outer green part will break, and inside of it is this thin white cord, which I wonder if you all can even see. Maybe not. And so that thin white cord is the fungus, and this outer green part is the algae and the cyanobacteria, and that white cord is Usnea. That means it's Usnea. If you can pull it and there's this flexy white cord that is visibly different from the outer coating, that means that what you have is Usnea. And it's really important, like, I think over time, at this point when I'm out picking, I can mostly just grab them and feel confident that they're Usnea, but it takes some time. And so, like, I would encourage when you're first learning to work with this species, every little bit that you pick, or every individual cluster, test, and just be sure. Like, once upon a time, I had a friend of mine who was like my apprentice or something like this. They would pick herbs. I ship herbs to people for money, and I can't always fill all the orders, and so this person used to work with me, for me, I don't know, and she went out to pick Usnea, and she was so pleased with herself. She brought this huge basket full, and she she brought 2 huge baskets full, and I had an order that I needed to fill right away. And I was like, great, thanks. And I grabbed the one basket, I stuffed it in a box, I shipped it to my client. I was like rushing, we had to get it out that day. And then I got home, and she had picked more than we needed for the order, so I was going to process the rest into medicine for my own company and just pay her for that. And I started digging through it, and like 60% of it was not Usnea. And that's bad, or, you know, especially like shipping that to someone is bad. Luckily, the basket that I shipped to the other person was mostly Usnea, but that's just a good reminder to me that it can be really easy to get sort of like over enthusiastic and to misidentify. And I don't think, like, I am not aware of any like deadly poisonous or otherwise toxic. Actually, no, that's not true. I am. Yeah, there are deadly poisonous and toxic lichens. So, you know, that could potentially be very bad if you misidentified. The only really poisonous one I know is the common name is wolfsbane, and it's a bright yellow lichen that mostly grows east of the Cascades. You've probably seen it in the pine, you know what I'm talking about? And the Latin name is not going to come to me. That's okay. I'll tell you all later. But that one's deadly poisonous. That'll kill you. That can kill you. It has the name wolfsbane because the colonial settlers used to, who like to kill wolves, would take like deer, cut them open, and stuff them with this lichen, and leave it out for the wolves to eat, which would poison the wolves and kill them. Hence the name wolfsbane. Yes, but back to Usnea. Oh, and one thing about lichens in general that's worth thinking about. So some people say that you shouldn't pick lichens and use them as medicine anymore because they're because of pollution. So like all of the lichens, right, absorb their food directly from the air, and so they will absorb toxins from the air, including radioactive isotopes. And so there's this one herbalist, Cascade Anderson Geller, who died young of cancer actually, who got like really into this, or like she was a naturopath. She's really cool. She has a lot of good like writings out there, and she was a great teacher. She's a naturopath out of Portland, and she decided to like really study this, and so she went like all over the place, and she would analyze samples of lichens that she found, looking for radioactive isotopes, and I think like heavy metals or whatever, and industrial toxins. And I would double check on this information, but I believe that she never found a sample that was free of either radioactive isotopes or heavy metals. And of course, like basically everywhere has background radiation, and so like I'm not sure. I've heard some people question the validity of the study, or like if the amount that she found in the lichens is like actually dangerous. But I've also had people, I mean, especially in the naturopathic community, there's a lot of like the quest for ultimate purity is like a strong part of that culture, which I have some critiques about. But especially like when I've been teaching at like the naturopathic college in Portland, I've definitely been called out a few times by people who are like, no one should ingest lichens. They're too toxic. And so I still ingest them. I still give them to clients. But I try, if I'm going to work with someone with them, I like to tell them that. And so everyone can kind of like make their own decision. But like just FYI, some people think that you shouldn't ingest them at all. But in general, so like all of these lichens, they're not something that you're going to take every day. P.S. So like Usnea, to get back to Usnea, Usnea grows all over the world. It's a lovely lichen. A very nice addition to your Materia Medica. So yeah, in terms of like physical actions, Usnea is an expectorant, so it loosens and helps to cough up the phlegm. It has an affinity for the lungs. And Usnea is a very strong antimicrobial, meaning that it kills microorganisms. In terms of like chemistry, Usnea, all species of Usnea are very rich in a compound which is called usnic acid, as well as a variety of other acids, all of which are like molecularly, structurally similar to one another, and all of which have similar actions in the body. The most profound one of which is being an antimicrobial. I forget if there's this factoid would be in the essay, but I can't pull it out of my brain right now. But I think they're either active on gram-positive or gram-negative bacteria. Not that necessarily will mean anything to you, or maybe it's both. But anyway, they're strongly antimicrobial. So like I don't really love this term, but I was first taught Usnea as an herbal antibiotic. And they do somewhat function in that way. I feel like that's a little bit reductionist. But preparations of Usnea work very well to kill microbes. So that's both internal, if you're sick, it will help kill the microbes in your body, and external. So like Usnea is a really nice herb for like your first aid kit. So if you just take the lichen and dry it and powder it, it's a really nice like dusting for wounds. It'll speed healing and help prevent infection. And also it can be nice on stuff that is already infected, to try to take care of that. Now, of course, if you have a really bad infection, I encourage you to see a doctor. Go to the hospital if you can. But especially like out in the bush or something, Usnea works very well. And yeah, nice to dust on your wounds. There's a variety of ways to ingest Usnea. I usually tincture them. I'll tincture them fresh. I'm going to talk more about tinctures and how to do it all next class, but I usually tincture them fresh at a 1-to-2 ratio, 80% ethanol, just to like rattle that out there. The usnic acids and the lichen-based acids are very alcohol soluble. Ryan Drum, who's an herbalist up in the San Juan Islands, likes to extract them into oil. He says that the usnic acid is more soluble in oil. He'll extract them into olive oil and feed people the olive oil. I think that guy's really smart, and I've never tried that, but I'm sure it works well. And in some ways, it seems nice to eat Usnea infused olive oil, maybe nicer than a tincture. But I like to work with tinctures for a variety of reasons that I'll go into more. And so yeah, but you don't want to take. Also, you can extract them into oil and use the oil externally, either as an oil or make it into a salve. And that is a similar way to how you might work with the powder. So like cuts and scrapes as an antibiotic to prevent infection. My puppy's got something. In terms of internal use, there's some concern about taking this organism long-term internally. If the industrial pollution or the radioactive isotope is a concern, it's a much bigger concern if you are ingesting them for long periods of time. Also, usnic acid itself is like a pretty strong or like harsh chemical, and I think there's some concern with long-term use about potential like kidney toxicity. And also, much like overusing pharmaceutical antibiotics, I've heard some concerns that taking too much usnic acid could alter your microbiome. So, like, right, where there are more bacterial cells in your body than there are human cells. Whatever, we're all made up of microorganisms, and they're crucial to the functioning of our bodies. And so like heavy antibiotic use can really wipe out your microbiome, which then can cause more like pathogenic microorganisms to take root in there, which then can lead to like long-term chronic health conditions. So it's good to be careful about antibiotics, including Usnea. I think that like that, there's no like double-controlled study, double-blind, showing that overuse of Usnea damages a person's microbiome. That's a hypothesis that I've heard floated, but it makes intuitive sense to me. And so I'd be cautious about it. And yeah, it's a strong herb. It's a herb for short-term use, maybe like a week or two. And I also it's kind of a harsher. I like to work with Usnea primarily in formulation, as opposed to taking it as a simple. And so I'll mix it with some herbs that will like, in a harm reductive sense, will kind of like both synergize with the Usnea and like help the Usnea to do their work, and also maybe balance out any like damage that might be done with Usnea. So that would be like, maybe a lymphatic to keep the lymph moving, and maybe like a diuretic to help keep you peeing enough so that it's not accumulating too much anywhere. But Usnea is a really nice herb to incorporate into a formula for someone who is acutely ill with like a bacterial, or there is a lot of evidence, including like double-blindy evidence, that this herb also is useful for viral infections. So that's pretty broad. So I like to work with Usnea for people who are acutely ill with something that is based upon a microorganism living in their body that they don't want anymore. And also like when I first started working with this herb, I would just work with it as a simple, and I worked with it kind of willy-nilly at that time. And this is when I was living in the bog, the weird little commune that I've referenced before. This is pre-Obamacare. Everyone was broke. None of us ever saw the doctor. And so when just like if someone was just starting to get sick, or if I was just starting to get sick, I would just give Usnea like pretty heavily, and oftentimes you would not get sick. So like that worked for me and didn't seem to do any damage. We were all in our early 20s, etc. But and that often doesn't take very long. Like if you take it for a week, like things will probably change. But yeah, I wouldn't take it long term. I like to take them in formulation, and I really like to work with Usnea for infections that are in the lungs. I think that is like really where they shine, because they do have that expectorant quality. So they will kill the microorganisms and also help to like get some of the phlegm up. So if someone is sick and they have like a bronchitis and they've got googly, messy lungs, Usnea is really good there. Also, yeah, Usnea and Lobaria both are helpful in conditions in which there is like a biofilm component, and so many infections that are difficult to treat have what is called a biofilm. And so what that means is like the microorganisms create this film, like this slime, gelatinous slime around themselves, and that's like their house that they live in. And it's difficult for the immune cells to get in there, and it's also difficult for antibiotics to get in there to kill them. And maybe double check me on it being both of these species, but so I sent you all the article by my friend Brian K. Weissenbach, and he talks a lot about this, and I think he mostly is talking about Lobaria, but I believe Usnea and usnic acid also has this, but double check me. Can be helpful in the case of biofilms. And so that's really nice, like for like long-term infections that are really hard. Like a walking pneumonia is like an example of a lung disease that involves a lot of phlegm that has a strong biofilm component and therefore is hard to treat. That's why they call it because you're still walking around. You're not like totally knocked out, like with other forms of pneumonia where like you just have to go to bed. And walking pneumonias will often like take longer to deal with. So yeah, I like to work with them in those sort of situations. Usnea also, this is also true of Lobaria. They're very similar in their actions. It's very nice as a dye herb, like you can dye wool or other cloths with it, and the acids in the lichens act as mordants, so the dye, or as fixatives, sorry. So the dye will hold fast in the cloth without needing any additional. Often you have to add some other chemicals or something, or else especially with natural dyes, or else they'll just wash out. But lichen dyes stay. Nice. Usnea will give kind of like an orangey color, if I remember correctly. And also that's the fixative. Also, Usnea is worked with in perfumery. I'll try to find. I have a nice lichen-based perfume that I'll try to find. Maybe I'll bring it tomorrow. Because they have, you all mentioned the smell of the tincture that has that nice, like, kind of earthy, kind of sweet smell. So lichen extractives, Usnea and Lobaria, are often used as like what's called the base note or a fixative in a perfume. And so it's not a big part of the smell, but it's a part that lingers. So like when the rest of the perfume has kind of volatilized away, the lichen is still there and still has kind of that earthy smell. And that's the fixative, the part that sticks to your skin. It also just helps to hold the perfume to the skin. It's Usnea. Lobaria, this is Lobaria. Or any questions about Usnea, comments about Usnea? So this is the other one. This is Lobaria. This one's already dried out, just from being in the breeze. Oh, this one's still wet. You can see how much they change color from wet to dry. So the Latin is Lobaria. I believe this one in my hand is Lobaria pulmonaria, which is the classic lungwort. There are 3 species of Lobaria that grow in this area. There's Lobaria pulmonaria, Lobaria oregana, and what's the third one? It's not going to come to me. And basically, Lobaria pulmonaria has this bright green color on the underside of the thallus. And that is the preferred species to work with as a medicine. I believe the oregana it's more of like a bluey green color. And then either the oregana or the other species has like a very frilly margin, like the margin of this is kind of smooth. But there's another species that it's kind of cut or serrated or frilly. And that is like not the preferred species. And then there's also the presence or absence. You'll have to also review, this is all in the essay that I sent you. The presence or absence of, I forget the anatomical features, but you can see them on these ones. These little, they're like, they're sex organs, they're sex organs, are present and visible on some of the species and not on some of the others. The common name for Lobaria is lungwort. And I like, so when I was studying botany, a lot of when I was doing my undergrad, I studied herbalism, and I studied like the hard sciences, often both at the same time. So I studied herbalism, I studied botany, I studied chemistry, organic chemistry. The hard science people love to make fun of the herbalists, and the herbalists love to make fun of the hard science people, and it's really frustrating. Because actually those disciplines like inform each other very well, and herbalism is a science, actually. But so when I was studying botany, and we were learning about this species, my botany teacher was like, gave this plant, this lichen, as an example of how foolish the doctrine of signatures is, which is like, so the doctrine of signatures is an old concept that's It comes from all sorts of different cultures. I associate it with like European, like Paracelsus, people like this, and it basically means like the visual appearance of an herb will tell you what it's good for. So like, you know, walnuts kind of look like brains. They're rich in omega-3 oils, which are good for your brain, as an example. So lungwort is given the name lungwort because A, it has these lobes that kind of look like the alveoli in the lungs, and B, the upper side of the thallus has these like creamy spots on a darker background, which people say looks like coughed up phlegm. And so this plant is called lungwort. And yeah, my botany teacher was basically like, those foolish, stupid people back in the day, they decided that just because this plant looked like lungs, it would be good for lungs. It's not good for lungs, as we now know in like our modern wise times. But haha, actually it's very good for lungs. That's what this plant does, or this lichen does. So yeah, kind of similar to Usnea. There is not usnic acid in this herb, but this herb does have also that the biofilm breaking up component, I do believe. Yeah, double check me in my essay again. And this herb has a very nice expectorant effect and helps to break up and loosen phlegm to get it up out. And this herb also is like somewhat antitussive, meaning like kind of antispasmodic, and will help like calm down just like a dry, irritated cough. And now sometimes those two things do not always go hand in hand, like expectorants and antitussives, depending on the quality of the cough. Usually I'd use one or the other. The antitussive or antispasmodic will just kind of like loosen up the tightened muscles around the lungs, which actually in certain situations can help the phlegm get out by just like loosening everything up. And this herb also has a nice, I think people are saying how it was warm, sweet, syrupy, thick. I kept talking about licorice. And so this herb also is kind of soothing and moistening to the various tissues that it comes in contact with, especially like mucous membranes. So it also just like is soothing and feels nice on people's like irritated and harshed out lungs. I think you mentioned how it brought up your lung pain, right? That was this one. And so yeah, it's probably, I bet you got some goo down in there, you know, or something. It was like touching that, and that can be uncomfortable. So yeah, I work with Lobaria somewhat similarly to Usnea. It can be nice to work with them both in the same formula. Brian, who wrote that article that I'll show you, works with Lobaria for like pertussis, which is whooping cough, which is like a pretty serious illness. I probably in most situations, if I had a client with whooping cough, I'd have them go to a doctor. But I'm curious about that, or that's an interesting little factoid. I've had really good luck incorporating Lobaria and also Usnea, sometimes in combination, again, into formulas for people with bad lung infections. So like, pneumonias, walking pneumonias, bronchitis, like things like this. And it really is really very helpful and often will resolve the condition pretty quickly. That's also another nice thing about how you find these plants in the winter, because in the winter around here everyone gets sick in their lungs. That's kind of classic. So it gets cold, it gets wet. At the same time that the lichens are blooming out in the woods, the molds are just blooming inside of our houses, and that gets people sick, that gets people's lungs sick. And so, yeah, these medicines that are so easy to gather in the wintertime are also really useful for the, like, rainforest wintertime lung crud sickness that is, like, really common and that you'll run into a lot if you start practicing. That's really common, especially people who live outside, or, especially people who live in, like, shitty crevices. This plant also has been worked with a lot as a for the urinary tract, as a soothing herb for the urinary tract, and I think that is more about the moistening and soothing quality of the herb. Although I imagine that they could be workable in UTIs, infections. I've never actually done this myself. UTI infections often have somewhat of a biofilm component because the bacteria are living in water essentially in your bladder and your urethra, and so the biofilm breaking component I imagine would be useful there. I would also incorporate other herbs if I was working on a UTI. Also, if someone had a really bad UTI and were starting to have kidney pain, especially, I'd send them to a doctor because that can get really bad. Yeah, this one especially, I have worked with in perfumes, and so again as a perfume fixative, it also makes a nice dye. This one, maybe it's like a browny orange kind of color. I haven't done it for a long time, but I like this one as a perfume fixative, and so with both of them, we'll talk about perfumes in the phytochemistry class. But the way that you extract the smell from these plants, it's not a distillation process, which is what you do with a lot of things, but you make what's called a multi-folded tincture. You fold a tincture, and so what that means is you would collect the herb, stuff it in a jar, cover it with alcohol, let it sit until it has some color and you can smell the herb, and then remove the herb, press it or squeeze it, keep the tincture, discard the herb, get some more of this fresh Lobaria and put it in the same tincture to tincture it again. And each time you do that, that is called a fold. You've folded the tincture again. Because just a tincture that you've tinctured one time, it kind of smells. But if you do, I don't have any with me right now. I gave it away to a friend who's a perfumist. But if you do 4 or 5 times, it really becomes fragrant and really works well as a fixative. And it's really nice. You mostly see Lobaria growing in maple trees. Sometimes I see them in oaks, and sometimes I see them on fruit trees. I rarely see them in alders, and I almost never see them in evergreen trees, coniferous trees. And they're not nearly as abundant as Usnea, but if you just wander around in the forests looking for maples, especially maples growing by water, by streams or something, because they like the extra moisture. If you find yourself a Lobaria tree, you can go there. Often, once they get really covered in Lobaria, they drop tons of it every year. And so it's pretty, once you find one, remember where it is. And you can just go there and, again, don't gather it all. I would leave the majority of it. But it's very simple and not pushy to just gather a bunch of the Lobaria off the ground and make your medicine. Yeah, I would not climb up in the tree and remove it, please. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I have about Lobaria. Yeah, I think you could stop the video if you want to.